The air crystallized in his lungs with every single breath. The wind howled so fiercely it was as if the mountains themselves were trying to tear him to pieces. He cowered in the deepest corner of the narrow stone crevice, wrapping his arms around his knees, and felt his heartbeats slowing with relentless certainty. The Himalayan blizzard left him entirely without a chance. Visibility was absolute zero. Death from hypothermia seemed merely a matter of hours. But suddenly, the frantic howling of the wind at the entrance was momentarily replaced by another sound, a soft rustling. Out of the absolute whiteout, without a single warning, a gigantic shadow slipped into the cramped cave. It was no human rescuer. Merely an arm's length from his face, two cold amber eyes flared in the gloom. The most elusive and deadly predator of these mountains was now trapped in the same icy snare alongside him. How do you survive when your only chance to keep from freezing to death is to avoid provoking a wild beast? To understand how a man and a snow leopard found themselves on the brink of life and death in a single cramped den, we must go back a few days. Spiti Valley, the early 2000s. This is a place the locals call the Middle Land, a harsh, barren yet piercingly beautiful stretch of the Indian Himalayas resting on the border with Tibet. There are no familiar forests or cozy glades here. Only razor-sharp stones, thin air that leaves your head constantly spinning, and boundless winds carrying the scent of dry dust and eternal snow. The protagonist of our story is a research biologist, a man who had dedicated his life to studying the migration of mountain goats. He knew these mountains. He knew their temper, their heavy silence that could be shattered by the roar of an avalanche at any second. The expedition was progressing slowly. Day by day, they climbed higher, up to where every breath brought an ache to the chest, and every step required superhuman effort. Heavy mountaineering boots slipped on the loose shale, and the sun, though blinding to the eyes, offered no warmth whatsoever. The snow leopard, or urbis, is the true ghost of these places, the spirit of the mountains, as the guides respectfully call it. To see one is an immense rarity, and an even greater stroke of luck, for thanks to its smoky gray fur patterned with black rosettes, it literally dissolves among the rocks. Snow leopards almost never attack humans. They avoid us, watching from above with their perfect predatory eyes, remaining entirely unseen. They are the absolute, silent masters of this cold world. On that fateful morning, the sky was crystal clear, a deep cobalt blue. The researcher had ventured just a couple of kilometers from the main camp to check the migration routes. He was alone, and that was exactly when the mountains decided to remind him who dictates the rules here. A cloud, as dense and gray as concrete, surged from behind the neighboring ridge with unnatural speed. The temperature plummeted so sharply, it was as if someone had flung open the door to a giant freezer. The infamous whiteout had begun. A wall of snow instantly swallowed everything around him. The researcher could no longer see even his own mittens. The space around him compressed to just a few centimeters. The wind knocked him off his feet, hurling fine ice crystals as sharp as shattered glass directly into his eyes. The distance back to the camp, which only an hour ago had seemed like an easy stroll, now turned into an insurmountable abyss. Taking steps blindly, with sheer suicide deep crevasses lay hidden beneath the snow. His fingers and toes began to lose all sensation, and the freezing cold crept through his multi-layered clothing straight to the bone. In utter despair, groping his way along the sheer wall of ice, he suddenly felt a void. It was a depression beneath a massive stone overhang, a narrow, dark niche in the rock. The man literally crawled inside, curled into a ball, hiding his face from the wind, and hoped merely to wait out the worst of it. He did not yet know that this cave was already someone's home, and the master had just returned. The cramped space of the stone niche smelled of dust, splintered rock, and that specific, sharp scent of ozone and frosty freshness that a merciless mountain blizzard always brings with it. The researcher sat, tightly clutching his knees with numb hands. Every beat of his own heart echoed in his ears as a heavy, muffled thud, drowning out even the frenzied roar of the wind outside. The air was so cold that every breath scorched his lungs, leaving a metallic taste of blood on his lips from micro-fissures. He tried to breathe as quietly as possible, as if the wind itself might hear him, find him, and drag him from this fragile sanctuary out into the white abyss. And in that exact moment of absolute isolation, when the silence inside the cave seemed thicker than the darkness, a shadow materialized from the white wall of snow. It made not a single sound, not a single crunch of snow or rustle of stone. 1 second the cave entrance was simply empty, and the next, a massive silhouette blocked it. The researcher stopped breathing. His pupils dilated completely, straining to catch the details in the gloom. It was him, an adult snow leopard. Nearly 50 kilograms of perfect, lethal, solid muscle. Hidden beneath thick, smoky gray fur, the animal paused. Its heavy gaze, glowing with a cold, almost unearthly amber, unerringly found the huddled figure of the man in the corner. The ibis's tail, thick and long, twitched ever so slightly. The predator's muscles tensed, and it took its first fluid step toward the researcher. Time stood still. The man's brain, gripped by a primal, paralyzing terror, screamed only one thing. This is the end, in such a confined space, where the distance between them was no more than 2 meters. A human would not have had a single chance even to raise a hand in defense. The researcher saw every detail, how the beast's mighty chest rose, how the snowflakes melted on its black, wet nose, how its whiskers gleamed. He waited for the pounce. He waited for the pain. But the leopard did not attack. Taking another step, it suddenly turned its massive head away, as if losing all interest in the human. The beast gracefully bypassed the center of the cramped niche, shook off the clinging snow, and simply lay down in the opposite corner, tucking its paws underneath itself and wrapping its nose in its magnificent, bushy tail. Imagine yourself in that icy trap, alone with the most dangerous predator of the Himalayas. Would you try to start screaming and waving your arms to scare the beast away, risking instantly provoking a deadly attack? Or would you freeze motionless, allowing your body to slowly turn to ice right beside it? The researcher chose the latter. He turned to stone. However, the true enemy in this cave was not the ibis, but the freezing cold. The temperature continued to drop rapidly. The sensation in his fingers and toes disappeared completely, replaced by a dull, aching pain, which soon turned into an alarming lightness. This was the onset of profound hypothermia. His eyelids became as heavy as lead. His mind began to drift into that dangerous, sweet illusion of comfort and warmth that is always the harbinger of freezing to death. The man took a final, convulsive gasp, his eyes closed, and his drained body, no longer obeying his will, slumped powerlessly forward, directly toward the sleeping predator. He sharply opened his eyes, jolted awake by his own shudder. He hadn't fallen. His back had pressed against the icy wall of the cave just in time, but something had changed. The space around him no longer felt so dead. The researcher realized with astonishment that he could still feel his face, and the air he inhaled no longer tore his lungs to shreds. The secret lay in the other corner. The body of an adult snow leopard has a normal temperature of about 39 degrees Celsius. In the tiny, almost airtight space of the stone niche, sheltered from the wind, the predator's massive body worked like a living, powerful furnace. The beast radiated heat. And this heat, with nowhere to dissipate, slowly but surely raised the temperature in their shared refuge. The researcher listened closely. Through the frantic roar of the storm outside, he heard deep, measured breathing. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. This sound acted like hypnosis. Instead of panic, a strange, completely irrational sense of calm began to spread through the man's chest. This perfect killer, the spirit of the mountains, wasn't merely ignoring him. Through its sheer presence, it was keeping him in this world. The researcher began to sync his own breathing to the beast's rhythm. It became his anchor to reality. The night dragged on like a century, woven from darkness, the howling of the wind, and the quiet snuffling of the wild cat. But when a faint, pale gray light finally began to pierce through the veil of snow at the entrance, the leopard's breathing rhythm suddenly changed. The beast snapped its eyes open and gracefully rose to all four paws. It stretched, momentarily unsheathing its razor-sharp claws, and headed straight for the exit, leaving the man alone. The man realized a terrifying truth. The storm had indeed died down, but he had absolutely no idea where he was, and every step in the deep, fresh snow could be his last, due to hidden crevasses. To stay meant certain death from starvation and the cold. But what awaited him outside? The pale morning sun mercilessly stung his eyes, reflecting off billions of fresh snowflakes. The storm had subsided, leaving behind a dead, ringing silence and a completely altered landscape. Everything that only yesterday had been a familiar mountain trail was now transformed into a seamless, blindingly white canvas beneath which lethal traps lay hidden deep crevasses and fluffy snow cornices ready to collapse under the slightest pressure. With great difficulty, the researcher forced his numb, exhausted body to move and crawled out of the stone niche, following the herbis. The frosty air still scorched his lungs, and his legs could barely support his weight. He took one hesitant step away from the shelter, then a second. Suddenly, the snow beneath his right boot gave an ominous crunch, and his leg plunged halfway into emptiness. The man instinctively recoiled backward, heavily gulping the icy air. It was a crevasse. Death had been patiently waiting literally a meter away from their nocturnal refuge. And then something happened that forever changed his understanding of the nature of wild beasts. The snow leopard, which had already managed to walk a few dozen meters away, suddenly stopped. It did not run off in search of prey or a safer place. The predator slowly turned around, and its piercing eyes, the color of liquid gold, met the man's gaze once again. The beast stood absolutely motionless amidst the endless snow, as if waiting. Guided by some deep, almost animalistic intuition, the researcher understood. He was being invited to follow. He gritted his teeth and began to carefully place his heavy boots precisely into those deep, perfectly round paw prints that the predator had left on the pristine snow cover. It was a surreal, silent dance on the edge of life and death. Ahead, softly rolling its steel muscles beneath its thick fur, stepped the most perfect killer of the highlands, and behind it, step for step, walked a half-frozen man. They moved like this for about an hour. The herbis walked a complex, zigzagging route, unerringly bypassing dangers invisible to the human eye. Several times, the massive cat stopped on the very edge of snow-filled chasms, sniffed the air, sharply changed its trajectory, and looked back again, checking if its strange companion was falling behind. The tension was so thick that the air seemed to crackle with it. Every crunch of snow underfoot echoed like a gunshot, but the leopard's bushy tail, rhythmically swaying ahead, became the researcher's only beacon in this white hell. Suddenly, the leopard froze at the edge of a large rocky outcrop. The researcher, feeling his vision darken from exhaustion, stepped closer and looked down. There, in the valley, cutting through the snow-white landscape with bright geometric patches, stood the tents of his expedition. Above one of them, a thin plume of smoke was rising. They had made it. He was alive. The man slowly shifted his gaze to his guide. The snow leopard stood on the edge of the cliff, its head raised proudly. The wind ruffled its magnificent smoky fur, blowing snowflakes off the black rosettes on its back. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met again. In those eyes, there was neither fear nor aggression, nor the desire to defend territory, only an absolute, unfathomable wild wisdom. The beast gave one last fluid sweep of its long tail, turned around, and in a few silent, weightless leaps dissolved among the gray rocks, as if it had never even existed. Science has a term for such behavior: forced tolerance. In moments of catastrophic natural disasters, such as forest fires or extreme storms, the basic survival instinct compels predators and prey to forge a temporary truce. Conserving one's own thermal energy becomes more important than hunting. This logically explains exactly why the Urbis allowed the human to remain in its cave overnight, and why its heat saved the researcher from hypothermia. But how can one explain what happened in the morning? Why did a solitary predator, which usually avoids humans at all costs, consciously guide an exhausted person along a safe route through a veritable minefield of snow crevasses? This goes entirely beyond the boundaries of dry biological algorithms. Perhaps at an altitude of 5,000 meters, where the thin air is barely enough to sustain life, the rules of our world simply cease to apply. Perhaps there exists a deep, invisible bond between all living creatures, one that activates only when death is breathing right in your face. What do you think? Was this a conscious act of empathy and rescue on the part of the spirit of the mountains, or simply a chain of incredible, coincidental instincts that a person in a state of shock interpreted in their own way? Be sure to write your thoughts in the comments. I would be very interested in reading your theories. One important remark is worth making. Although this story is profoundly striking in its detail, it is not a 100% documented fact. It is rather a beautiful mountain legend, one of those captivating tales that climbers and guides whisper to one another in snowbound base camps. Over the years, this narrative has become so firmly rooted in quasi-scientific lore that the line between reality and myth has completely blurred. But does that make it any less significant? After all, every mountain legend is born from a drop of truth, hidden somewhere out there amidst the eternal snows and the ruthless cold. If this story made you hold your breath and look at wildlife from a different angle, support this video with a like and subscribe to the channel. There are even more uncharted, terrifying, and awe-inspiring stories from around the world waiting for us ahead. Thank you for being with me. And remember, we know far less about this world than we think.